love, devotion, trust. We like to believe these things are unshakable, that the people closest to us are the ones who would protect us the most. But sometimes, love isn't what it seems. How far would someone go to be with the person they love? Would they betray their vows? Their faith? Would they kill? Tonight, we unravel the tragic story of Thad and Michelle Reynolds. They were high school sweethearts, deeply rooted in their faith, admired in their community. A love story that should have lasted a lifetime. But on the night of July 5th, 2004, something unimaginable happened. A brutal crime, a shocking betrayal, and a twisted truth that took years to fully unravel. What really happened that night? And why would someone want Thad Reynolds dead? Welcome to Vic's True Crime Stories, where we dive deep into the most chilling cases, peeling back the layers of deception, secrets, and lies. If you love true crime, hit that subscribe button, because tonight's case is one you won't forget. Thad and Michelle Reynolds were the kind of couple people admired. They had that effortless charm, the kind that made others believe in love. High school sweethearts, deeply rooted in their faith, they seemed destined to spend their lives together. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable connection. They were young, in love, and convinced that nothing could ever come between them. They married straight out of high school, eager to build a life together. For a while, everything felt like a dream, the kind of love story you'd expect to hear in church sermons about patience and devotion. Thad was hard-working, the kind of man who took his responsibilities seriously. Michelle was warm, nurturing, and devoted to their growing family. They had their fair share of struggles, like any young couple, but nothing seemed strong enough to shake the foundation of what they had. But love, no matter how passionate, doesn't always guarantee a happy ending. 5 years into their marriage, something shifted. Maybe it was the pressures of life, the weight of expectations, or the reality that love alone isn't always enough to keep two people together. Whatever the reason, Thad and Michelle made a decision that shocked those who knew them. They divorced. For 4 years, they lived separate lives. Thad continued working, building a stable future, while Michelle navigated life on her own. It would have been easy for them to move on, to accept that their love had run its course. But some connections are hard to sever. When they found their way back to each other, it was as if the time apart had only strengthened their bond. They remarried, this time more determined than ever to make it work. It felt like a second chance, a rare opportunity to rewrite the story they had once believed was over. They welcomed more children, expanded their family, and poured their energy into their church, Hollywood Baptist. Thad became a deacon, a guiding presence for those who looked up to him. Michelle devoted herself to youth programs, helping shape the next generation. To the outside world, they had it all: a loving marriage, beautiful children, and a faith that kept them grounded. They were the couple everyone turned to for advice, the kind of love story people used as an example of resilience and commitment. They stood together in church, their hands intertwined, their smiles unwavering. They had been through the worst and found their way back to each other. If anyone believed in the power of love, it was them. But love stories aren't always what they seem. Sometimes, the perfect couple isn't as perfect as they appear. Sometimes, the people who seem the most devoted are the ones keeping the biggest secrets. July 5, 2004, was supposed to be just another night. Thad Reynolds was at work, finishing his shift at the Frito-Lay warehouse. The place was quiet, the hum of machines filling the space as workers wrapped up their tasks. Thad was the kind of man who took his job seriously. He had a family to provide for, responsibilities to meet. He wasn't the type to slack off or leave early. That night was no different. At some point during his shift, he stepped outside. Maybe for a break, maybe to clear his head. He had no way of knowing that someone was waiting for him. Someone who had come there for one reason and one reason only. The attack was sudden, brutal. A knife sliced through the night, tearing into flesh again and again. 19 times. Each wound deliberate. This wasn't a moment of lost control. a random act of violence. Whoever did this wanted to make sure Thad Reynolds didn't leave that parking lot alive. When the investigators arrived, the scene was nothing short of horrifying. Blood pooled beneath Thad's body, soaking into the pavement. His injuries told the story of a vicious, personal attack. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that he had tried to fight back. It was as if he never saw it coming. There was no robbery. His wallet was untouched. His car sat nearby, undisturbed. It was clear from the beginning, this wasn't about money or a random act of violence. Someone had wanted him dead, and they had made sure of it. But who? And why? Thad Reynolds had no known enemies. He was a devoted husband, a father, a man of faith. He spent his days working hard, his evenings with his family, and his Sundays in church. To everyone who knew him, he was the last person anyone would want to harm. Yet, someone had. Someone who had gotten close enough to strike 19 times. Close enough to make sure he wouldn't survive. And whoever they were, they had just gotten away with murder. Michelle Reynolds stood at the front of the church, dressed in black, her face pale, her hands trembling. The congregation watched in silence as she clung to her children, her body shaking with grief. She was a widow now, a wife who had lost her husband in the most violent way imaginable. Hollywood Baptist Church had never seen a tragedy like this. The people who had once looked up to Michelle and Thad as the perfect couple now wept with her, offering prayers and condolences. The pastor spoke of faith, of endurance, of finding peace even in the darkest of times. And Michelle, broken, devastated, nodded along, tears streaming down her face. But something wasn't right. Grief is unpredictable. It hits people in different ways. Some collapse under its weight, unable to function. Others cling to routine, desperate for a sense of normalcy. But Michelle had already purchased a funeral dress. Before the police had even finished their investigation, before the details of her husband's murder were fully known, she had gone shopping for something to wear to his funeral. At first, it seemed like a small thing, a way to prepare herself for the inevitable. But as days passed, small things started piling up. People noticed that Michelle wasn't behaving like a woman whose husband had just been brutally murdered. Her sorrow felt rehearsed, her tears carefully timed. Some said she seemed distant, detached, like she was playing a role rather than living in the nightmare of losing the man she had once promised to love forever. And then, there was the conversation. The one that changed everything. One of Michelle's co-workers was going about their day when they overheard something that made them stop in their tracks. A voice. Words that sent a chill down their spine. Michelle Reynolds wasn't just grieving. She had a secret. And once that secret got out, everything people thought they knew about Thad's murder would start to unravel. The phone call wasn't meant for anyone else's ears. It was a quiet conversation, just a few hushed words, but something about it made the coworker stop and listen. Michelle's voice didn't sound like that of a grieving widow. There was no sorrow, no pain, just urgency. The words were sharp, her tone careful. Whoever was on the other end wasn't offering condolences. This was something else. Something private. Something she didn't want anyone to hear. The coworker couldn't shake the feeling that this phone call meant something. It didn't fit the picture Michelle had painted in public. And when they went to the police with what they heard, investigators began to wonder if there was more to Thad Reynolds' murder than they initially thought. It didn't take long for them to find it. A secret life. A trail of digital whispers hidden in emails and text messages. Michelle Reynolds hadn't been mourning her husband for long. Because long before Thad was taken from this world, she had already given her heart to someone else. His name was Scotty Harper. A youth minister, a man of faith. Someone Thad had trusted. He had been a friend to the Reynolds family, welcomed into their lives with open arms. He prayed with them, counseled them, stood beside them in church. And all the while, he had been having an affair with Michelle. The messages told the story. Promises whispered through the glow of a screen. Desires confessed in words that never should have been written. A love that had no place in the life Michelle had built with Thad. And suddenly, everything started making sense. The distant look in Michelle's eyes. The carefully placed grief. The funeral dress that had been bought too soon. But this wasn't just about a broken marriage or a betrayal of vows. This wasn't just about love letters and stolen moments. Because Scotty Harper wasn't just a man tangled in an affair. He was tangled in something far worse. The deeper investigators looked, the more things stopped adding up. Michelle Reynolds wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a woman with secrets. And at the center of it all was Scotty Harper. Scotty had been careful, or at least, he thought he had. But secrets have a way of leaving behind evidence. It started with a simple lead. A vehicle, one that shouldn't have been anywhere near the Frito-Lay warehouse on the night of July 5th. But it was. Multiple witnesses placed it there, sitting just out of sight. It was Scotty Harper's car. Then came the receipts. Paper trails don't lie. A purchase, made not long before the murder. A knife. Not just any knife, but one sharp enough, deadly enough, to match the wounds found on Thad Reynolds' body. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread. And when detectives started pulling, everything began to unravel. And then, there were the glasses. Blood spattered, discarded carelessly as if the person who owned them had been too shaken, too hurried, to notice. DNA testing didn't take long. The blood belonged to Thad. The glasses belonged to Scotty Harper. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Scotty's name was no longer just tied to Michelle in whispers of an affair. Now, it was tied to a crime scene. A brutal murder. A betrayal that ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. So, the detectives made their move. They brought him in for questioning. Face to face with the truth, with the lies unraveling around him, Scotty Harper had one chance to explain. One chance to deny it. One chance to save himself. And then, he did something no one expected. Scotty Harper sat across from investigators, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly together. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in on him. He had walked in with confidence, with the belief that he could control the situation, that he could lie his way out. But the evidence was too much. The blood on the glasses, the knife receipt, the vehicle near the warehouse. The look in the detective's eyes told him everything. This was over. The questions came one after the other. Where were you that night? Why was your car spotted near the warehouse? How do you explain the blood on your glasses? Each time, Scotty hesitated just a little longer. The silence stretched. The weight of his own secrets pressed down on him. He could keep lying. He could keep pretending. But in the end, the truth was already out there. It was just waiting for him to admit it. And then he broke. The words spilled out, shaky at first, then faster. He told them everything. How he had driven to the warehouse that night, waiting for the perfect moment. How he had stepped inside, heart pounding, hands shaking. How he had watched Thad, unaware, focused on his work, completely defenseless. And then, the attack. 19 stab wounds. The knife tearing through fabric, through skin, through muscle. The fight in Thad, the desperate struggle to hold on, to survive. The blood, so much blood. And then, nothing. Just silence. Scotty Harper sat in that room, tears in his eyes, voice trembling as he confessed to it all. The murder. The betrayal. The destruction of a man who had once trusted him. But there was one question left. The biggest question of all. Because Scotty Harper hadn't done this alone, had he? Michelle Reynolds had played the grieving widow perfectly. The tears, the black dress, the quiet sorrow. But was she just a woman who had lost her husband? Or was she something else entirely? The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Scotty Harper sat still, expressionless, as the words rang through the room. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chance. No redemption. No future outside of a prison cell. He had destroyed a man's life, shattered a family, and betrayed every vow he had ever taken. Now, he would spend the rest of his days paying for it. Michelle Reynolds, however, would not face the same fate. She wasn't the one who held the knife. She wasn't the one who delivered those 19 brutal stab wounds. But she was the reason it happened. The phone calls, the secret meetings, the whispered promises of a future without Thad in the way. And so, after striking a plea deal, Michelle was sentenced to 20 years in prison. A far cry from the life sentence many believed she deserved. 4 years, the Reynolds family tried to move forward. To heal. To find some kind of peace. Thad Reynolds had been a father, a husband, a man of faith. His children grew up without him. His church mourned his loss. And Michelle, the woman who had once stood beside him at the altar, sat behind bars for orchestrating his death. But then came the twist no one saw coming. On July 7, 2024, Michelle Reynolds walked free. 14 years served. 6 years shaved off. A woman once convicted in connection to her husband's brutal murder was back in the world, no longer confined to a prison cell. And that leaves one final question. Where is Michelle Reynolds now? And what does her release mean for the people who still carry the scars of what she did? The echoes of Thad Reynolds' murder never faded. Not for his children. Not for the community that once saw the Reynolds family as a symbol of love, faith, and devotion. The shock of his death turned into grief, and grief into an unbearable weight that his children were forced to carry for the rest of their lives. The father who had tucked them in at night, who had led them in prayer, who had stood beside them at church, was gone. And the person responsible? The woman they had once called Mom. 4 years, Michelle Reynolds sat in prison, serving her time while the world outside moved on. But the wounds she left behind never healed. Her children were left to grow up in the shadow of her choices, knowing that the woman who had once kissed them goodnight had played a role in their father's murder. The community, too, was left with scars. A church that had welcomed Scotty Harper as a youth minister, that had trusted Michelle as a devoted wife, was left shaken. The betrayal cut deep. But then came the final, almost unbelievable twist. Michelle Reynolds is free. After just 14 years, she stepped out of prison, a woman who had conspired in her husband's death now walking among the rest of the world, while the man who carried out the crime remains behind bars. Scotty Harper will never see freedom again. But Michelle, she is out. Free to start over. Free to live her life. Free to do whatever she wants. It's a chilling thought. A woman who once sat in church pews with her husband, smiling for family photos, whispering, "I love you," while secretly planning his death, is no longer a prisoner. She served her sentence. Legally, she paid her price. But did justice really prevail? Or is this just proof that sometimes, the perfect life is nothing more than a perfect lie? So, what do you think? Did Michelle Reynolds get off too easy? 14 years for playing a role in her husband's brutal murder. Was that justice? Or did she manipulate the system the same way she manipulated Scotty Harper? I want to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think she should still be behind bars? Or do you believe she's served her time? And if you love unraveling real-life mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because this is just one story. And trust me, there are plenty more waiting to be told.